Welcome back. We now have a whole panel of political scientists. Makes me suspicious why so many of the law professors have left the room, but because they can't handle the truth. Since I wear both those hats, I could say that. I will follow Pam's tradition and say this group needs no introduction. And so with that, let's start with Charles Smith's paper on Is There Really an Opinion Backlash to Litigation Secured Rights?
Well, like everyone else who's had the privilege to stand up here, I want to start by thanking Gary and James for putting together just an amazing conference. Many of us last night were observing at the hotel that was the single best conference day I've ever had. And my first job was at the University of Miami, and we had unlimited conference budgets because I was in the business school. And so I would do 10 conferences a year, and it was just staggeringly good. So I just want to echo that. So 50 years ago, Martin Luther King was sitting in jail in Birmingham. And a letter got published in the press. It was by white clergy that were criticizing him for the shenanigans he was up to. And he responded with what I'm sure many of you have read by now, a letter from Birmingham jail. Got a couple different titles, depending on where you track it down. But I went back to the hotel room last night and I actually pulled it up and read it because I'd been so moved by the panel that I should say I reread it. And in it, he says lots and lots and lots of things that are worth thinking about in this context, LGBT rights, LGBTQ rights. But one of the things that's germane to this paper is he says, you know, there isn't any reason to wait. You don't ask, you don't get it. Never before has a privileged majority voluntarily given up its position of privilege. You have to push and you have to ask. So we started working on this. When I say we, I want to point out that I've got 3 amazing co-authors with this. Benjamin Bishon. Ben Bishon's at UC Riverside. Many in the room know him. Tom Hayes is newly minted PhD now at the University of Connecticut. He was a grad student at Riverside. Matt Incantalupo is a grad student at Princeton. And we brought Matt and Tom in on this project over time. So I wish they could all be here. They wish they could all be here, but they're also all working away on this paper, actually, as we speak. I want to first talk about what the paper's about generally. It comes up because as the Prop 8 litigation was pushing along, a lot of folks said they shouldn't do it, and we've all talked about this in many different contexts, but the reason they shouldn't do it was there would be backlash. And so when we talk about backlash, we know that from time that we've thought about these sorts of things, a contestation over rights, groups that have had their rights taken away or restricted by some reason are always told, wait, wait, wait. Don't move too far, don't move too fast. Wait for the pie in the sky by and by. You don't get it today. And if you ask for it too aggressively today, you're going to piss people off. There's going to be several kinds of bad things that could happen. One of them would be policy backlash, and we've seen this. We've heard a good bit about it, where legislatures act to push back against people. But the thing that we're interested in is public opinion backlash, and the reason that we're especially interested in it is public opinion can inhibit policy development in democracies in ways that it doesn't matter so much in other kinds of places. What we're talking about in this paper is backlash in the context of public opinion. It's the public reacting to claims for rights or rights contestation. I've got a monitor up here, so I have to double click. There's a fair amount of literature on this. and I'm not going to bore you too much by reading all the different words, but there's a lot of literature on this. This is just an example. Jenny Mansbridge is working away on this stuff for a good bit of her career. And really, this is the point that we're focusing on. So a significant, sharply negative shift in opinion, public opinion, against a policy or group that occurs in response to some event that threatens a status quo. It can be policy change, it could be increased visibility, it could be other perceived threats to the status quo. So it doesn't actually have to be a success. It's one of the things people said about the Prop 8 litigation. All right, well, backlash, this is not just a gay thing, to paraphrase one of the other panelists from yesterday. Latinos, there's research about Latinos, there's research about African Americans. Again, I can't think of a more articulate pushback on backlash than the letter from the Birmingham jail. Women, gays, and lesbians. So we're asking a couple of things. One is, who is it that lashes back? Who lashes back? This is a weird way to phrase it, but so if we think of it from a psychological threat standpoint, social dominance and orientation concepts would say, if you're concerned about an alteration in the status quo. So if gay people are allowed to get married, then somehow straight people's marriages are diluted. Terrible things will happen. There's also a whole cluster of notions, integrated threat theory, and these are more direct threats. My job may be imperiled if we change immigration. My opposite-sex spouse may turn gay if they're allowed. It's hard to conceptualize exactly what some of these things are. We also are interested in social groups, evangelicals particularly, with sharply negative views, or those people who are uninformed. I haven't thought about this issue, but now that I have thought about this issue, I'm angry about this issue. I'm unhappy about this issue. The slides go a little low, sorry about that. So then the second question is, well, how does backlash manifest itself? So if we can figure out who is it that lashes back, then we might ask ourselves, how do they lash back? There are three ways. Their attitudes towards the group could change to be more negative. Their attitudes towards a specific policy could change to be more negative. Or how strongly they feel about a policy could change and become more negative. So in short, it's probably too late for that, but in short, these are our questions. Does backlash occur? Who's likely to experience backlash, if we can phrase it that way? It's sort of an odd nomenclature, because you might say, well, it's the group that's targeted that's actually experiencing the backlash. But what we mean by this is who's going to lash back? And what triggers it? What makes it happen? Is it, Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoes the legislative delivery of same-sex marriage by saying, this is something the courts should decide rights. At the same time, Mitt Romney's saying, no, I disagree with this. The legislature should decide this. So does it matter? Does it matter how we get the policy delivered? So this is what that's a slide about why we care about gays. I don't think I need to go into that here. So we're just going we're going to go into the three primary hypotheses that we come up with. Those who are susceptible to feelings of backlash in response to advances in gay rights will take more negative issue positions on gay rights than groups that do not. As you get more information about gays and lesbians, then your attitude should become more negative. And backlash against gays is stronger when it's judicial fiat rather than legislative institutions, because this is the pitch. This is what we get told time and time again by the press. So now how did we do this? Well, we did it a couple different ways. We started out with Mechanical Turk, and we got 2,400 respondents to take an online survey that had an embedded experiment. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But then, and here's the clever part, we arranged for the Supreme Court to make a series of major decisions about gay rights. And we scheduled this for shortly after we finished our first Mechanical Turk run. And then we were able to do our control scenario after, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But then we also took a look at some Annenberg data and did kind of a large-N observational analysis as well. So let me push that forward. 2,400 respondents between June 7th and June 17th. Pre and post Supreme Court rulings, June 27th and 29th. We had about 500 respondents for the natural experiment over the Supreme Court hearings. Now, this is what we did. We had a baseline. There was no LGBT content at all. It was a gun policy. We had LGBT content, but not policy related. It was a gay pride parade. Oh my God, they're almost naked. We didn't actually show them a parade. We just gave them a little paragraph, that, like a news story that said, here it is. And I can show it to anybody that's interested. We did one with LGBT content. I'll zip along. We did one with LGBT content, policy content being delivered by the legislature, also being delivered by the courts, and then also being delivered by referendum. I'm going to flip through some of these early charts because I'm running short on time, obviously. This is just kind of where we are with thermometer ratings about gays, attitudes towards gay marriage. But if we look at the differences, and this is really one of the important slides, we look at the differences in averages, thermometer ratings from the control for gays and lesbians. You can see that we break it up into different groups, how the policy is delivered. Legislature, parade, court, referendum. The different controls, you see there isn't a whole lot of difference except that, except you can see that people that have high status, high social group, they're worried about the parade, and the moderates are a little bit worried about the parade too. So it's kind of interesting. There isn't policy delivery, it's just the gay pride parade. So let me go on real quick because I really want to show you the natural experiment the most. Bottom line is we don't find backlash. We do not find backlash. It is not meaningfully apparent. It is not statistically shown in any of these first runs. So the question might be, well, maybe people didn't care about Oregon, and maybe because public opinion has changed, we're somehow not capturing that. But we then do the before and after the Supreme Court rulings. You can't get more clear than this. Every single press outlet was talking about it. It was on the front page of every paper, and it delivered absolutely positive, unambiguous same-sex equality policy in as clear and concise way as it could. And you'll see basically we get not a lot of movement. This is the gay thermometer. This is gay marriage opinion. This is intensity of feelings about gay marriage. And we get pretty flat responses. So let me just go on. I'll show you the Annenberg data stuff real quick. This is the Massachusetts ruling. This is the California ruling that says stop issuing marriages. And you can see that while there's a dip, and we do these because of both 2004, while there's a dip, it goes away pretty quick. And it moves back to where it was pretty quick. So I'm just going to go forward a little bit quicker. So here's the thing. We looked for backlash, public opinion backlash, every way we could think of to find it. We pulled it apart every single way we could, and we couldn't find it. We think it's a myth. It could be that it occurs, but it occurs at a level below our ability to detect it. There are only modest, statistically not significant evidence of backlash in 3 of the almost 50 different ways we looked at it, or 42 different ways we looked at it. Court rulings do not result in more negative reactions than legislative rulings or anything else that we can come up with, the referendum, anything. The results aren't due to a weak stimulus that failed to pose a sufficient threat because the Supreme Court rulings expanding gay rights did not elicit backlash. So you might say, well, our experiment's just an experiment, nobody cares, but shoot, the Supreme Court actually delivered policy, and people didn't get upset. The results don't seem to be a function of recently changing attitudes either. If you go back to 2004, I have a bunch of auxiliary slides if anybody's interested in them, but I can't imagine that you're that interested in them. Here's the bottom line. We should sue, we should sue, we should sue. Litigate, litigate, litigate. They had it right. Everybody needs 5 lawyers today. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Skip Lupia from the University of Michigan. I want to start again by thanking Jane and Gary for having us here. This is just a tremendous event and really inspiring. I could go on, but I don't have that much time. And another source of inspiration to me is my co-authors and my students. We're going to talk about 3 projects that push in the same direction, and I think my job is to get off stage as soon as possible. Here's the question I'd like to pose to you. The last couple of years have been pretty good if you're an advocate of same-sex marriage. And the question is, how good will the future be? Now, some people think it'll be really good. In fact, some people think that the fight is over, or as we heard last night, it'll be over in the next 5 years. So what I want to ask you is, what's your evidence that the recent gains in public opinion and public support for same-sex marriage and the recent gains in the ballot box will continue in the future? What's your evidence for that? Because we can think about the explanations people give, and one is a variant of the contact hypothesis, and the idea that as more people come out, as there's more acceptance, more people become comfortable with the LGBT politics, LGBT issues, and they become more acceptance. So there are variations of that. So that would explain public opinion change. And with respect to legal change, there's the idea of responsiveness. That as people get more supportive, the laws change. And so those are common beliefs. And again, the question I want to put out there is, what's the evidence that this will continue? Because what I'll tell you about the contact hypothesis and variants of the responsiveness hypothesis is that in other domains, they don't work that well. There are instances where increased contact leads to increased acceptance, and there are instances where it has just the other effect. So which situation are we in? With those questions in mind, I want to just talk about a few headwinds, some things that might make the future harder than the recent past, so that if you were an advocate, the tactics that you might have, this is not the time to let off the gas pedal, it's a time to really rethink tactics and how to make the next move. There are 3 headwinds we're going to talk about. One is requirements for changing state constitutions. One big wall is that restrictions to marriage equality are written into state constitutions. And so, if the courts do the job, then that would take care of it. But if you're counting on it being done at the ballot box, then the requirements for changing state constitutions matter. Another is discussed reactions to LGBT persons and policies. And we're going to talk about how that might affect opinion trends in the future. There are some differences in how people react to LGBT and other folks that might affect what types of appeals are persuasive. We'll also talk about unseen variation in national polls. We've heard about the national numbers, the 1% per year, and that increasing. But is that hiding some interesting things at the local level? And more importantly, is it possible that maybe we've moved all the people that are easy to move, and that the next step would be harder? So those are things that we're going to put out there. Now, each of these inquiries that we'll talk about provides 2 things. One is a reason to doubt optimistic appraisals, but in every case, we're also talking about insights that can improve advocacy and approach. I mean, if you want to take the journey, it's important that you know where the road is, and so we're going to try and point that out. So let's talk about institutional variation. As you know, there are a lot of restrictions in state constitutional amendments. One thing that you guys might know this, but what some people don't know, is that states vary widely in the requirements for changing their constitutions. In some states, all you need is a simple majority of the electorate on election day. And in other states, it's very different. Okay? And so if you wanted to change the current constitutional status of same-sex marriage, you'd have to deal with that. Constitutional amendments are important at the state levels because they basically take the state-level judges out of the equation. Right? If it's a constitutional amendment, the state judge doesn't have the ability to say it's not constitutional. You can kick it upstairs to a federal judge, and that's what happened with Prop 8, but you're really handcuffing the state-level judges when you put it in the Constitution. In 49 states, if you want to have constitutional change, one of the main sequences ends at the ballot box. So as we have these facts in mind, as you think about the legal status of same-sex marriage, we have a story. And the conventional wisdom is, as attitudes change, these laws are going to change because you can win at the ballot box. So the story we have is that, in states where same-sex marriage is not constitutionally prohibited, there are lots of people who look like that. And in states where it's illegal, we have lots of people who look like that. And so, the basic story is we have states with more of these and less of these, then the Constitution will change. But that's not actually how it has worked so far. So let me just put a proposition on the table, and I'll throw the evidence. Suppose you wanted to predict the current day state constitutional status of same-sex marriage. Which set of materials would give you a better ability to predict it? Would it be the best public opinion polls you could find now, or would it be decisions about how to change the constitution of a state that were made over 100 years ago? And the answer in a paper we showed in 2010 is it's not even close. It's the decisions made 100 years ago. If you want to know where same-sex marriage is constitutionally restricted, look at how easy it is to change a constitution. Right? So the basic idea there is there are three types of states. Direct constitutional initiative states are like California. You get people, they collect 5% of the votes that were in the last gubernatorial election. The wording gets approved by the Secretary of State, I think it is here. You put it on the ballot, you get 50%. It's in the Constitution. There are other states that vary. They have more requirements. And typically, to make a long story short, the legislature is involved, and sometimes you need big supermajorities. So now I want to show you a decisive figure here. So here's 100%. 100% of the states where you can change the Constitution by a simple majority of the people, they have all passed restrictive amendments, every single one. In states where you need a simple majority of the legislature and a vote, about 50%. And in places where you need huge supermajorities or multiple versions of a legislature, only 33%. Now, what's interesting about this is these are the average levels of support in these three states. It's virtually identical. There are no differences in the opinions of these states. But if you look at the current constitutional status of same-sex marriage, the difference is in how difficult it is to change. So the bottom line for this first headwind is the state constitutional status of same-sex marriage is not a straightforward reflection of how people feel about it. It has a lot to do with the different ways in which they can change their constitutions. But that's not the only headwind, and I'm going to let Logan tell you about another factor.
Thank you, Skip. So another hidden headwind I would like to tell you about, or perhaps not so hidden given that Professor Goldberg talked about this a little bit yesterday, is the role that disgust might play in public opinion about LGBT issues. Disgust is an emotion. Miller describes it as an emotion that is fundamentally about protecting and maintaining the self. And emotions have a few elements. One of them is a physical component. And so an interesting attribute of disgust is that our reactions have a sort of physical experience, an immediate physical experience. There are physiological changes that occur in the body. It's a sort of embodied emotional experience. And so we react to stimuli, disgusting stimuli, before devoting any sort of conscious thought to them. One author describes disgust as often experienced as a particularly visceral feeling because it can trigger nausea, throat clenching, and the very physical process of food expulsion to protect the body from harmful contaminants. And I keep emphasizing this physical, the embodiedness of this experience. I'll come back to that in a bit about why it's so important for LGBT politics. And emotions also have an expressive or behavioral component, and for disgust, what that behavioral component is it compels us to avoid or to create distance between ourselves and the offending stimuli. Again, it's part of this impulse to protect ourselves from something potentially contaminating or harmful. And so on a theoretical level, there's reason to expect disgust to play a significant role in LGBT politics. Given this concern of disgust with protecting the body from contagion or harm, this contagion can also be thought of as either physical or moral, and scholars have talked about it in both ways. And sexuality involves both of these domains, physicality and morality, as we've seen play out over the years in politics. And indeed, scholars often cite unusual or taboo sex practices as a specific elicitor of disgust. And indeed, homosexuality was labeled a literal sickness for many, many years, as most of us know. And Professor Eskridge reminded us earlier that the book of Leviticus itself is about prohibitions or about impurity, or put another way, contaminants. And so given that sexuality is intimately connected to disgust in this way, I want to suggest that the politics of LGBT rights may never be fully separable from a politics of disgust, or as Professor Carter suggested yesterday, politics of respectability. And on an empirical level, this is supported by scholarship, mostly in psychology. Scholars, I got ahead of myself here. Scholars have shown that people who are more disgust sensitive, that is, more easily prone to being disgusted by a whole range of things, not about gay people in particular, but just in general, more easily disgusted, express consistently more negative and prejudicial attitudes toward LGBT people. And more directly, exposure to gay sex in particular, and these studies use exposure to gay pornography as their stimulus here. Gay sex, the thought of gay sex or exposure to the idea of gay sex induces disgust reactions specifically compared to, for example, exposure to heterosexual pornography. And so there's this specific connection of gay sex itself, gay people and gay sex itself, inducing a disgust reaction. And while there isn't work yet, and that's what I'm hoping to do, about how this disgust elicited by gay people or gay sex in particular has direct political consequences, there is plenty of literature within psychology in particular on the implications that disgust might have for politics more generally. For example, after exposure to disgusting stimuli, people are more likely to make much harsher moral judgments. And this effect has been shown to be unique from other negative emotions like sadness. Furthermore, disgust is also unique in its connection to LGBT attitudes. This particular study, and others that I can talk about later, showed that the more easily disgusted you were, the more negative attitudes you had about gay marriage, but not about any other political issue that they asked about, including immigration, welfare, a whole bunch of other issues. So that's unique. Disgust is unique in its connection to LGBT politics here. And finally, disgust has behavioral implications, and I can skip ahead, talk about that later. And in a more visually intuitive way, I just want to, sort of the big picture, the idea that asking people to think about gay issues on some level can elicit disgust reactions which have a whole range of political outcomes that I just talked about, and I can talk about the ways that our movement has used sort of these normalizing strategies to attempt to diffuse this process by asking people not to be disgusted by gay folks by saying, look, we're just like you, there's nothing disgusting about us. But particularly given what Skip said earlier about how maybe we've already persuaded the people who were easiest to persuade, we might be hitting a limit soon on the effectiveness of these normalizing strategies, and so I want to suggest there's a different way that we can move forward to address this headwind. But let Chris talk about one more.
And so I want to pick up from where Logan thought that maybe we are hitting a wall in terms of who we can convert, and think about this again in the context of getting states to where we need them to get marriage legalized. Chad Griffin set this out very starkly last night, that maybe the courts will do it in the next 5 years, but if we're going to have to do this through public opinion, I'm going to contend that his 5-year assessment is far too optimistic because of the interaction of opinion change and institutions. So opinion change, despite being this nice linear trend nationally, is not following the same pattern at the state level. And this is crucially important because the states are the venues where this is going to be fought. So this national trend to investigate what's happening at the state level, I'm going to turn to a method that Jeff Latz has helped pioneer, and so if you don't like it, yell at him instead of me. Well, all that I've done here is collect a bunch of public polls from 2004 to the present, build these into one mega poll with a really large N, and then apply a method that we call multi-level regression and post-stratification to it. MRP works by fitting a multi-level choice model like we might with a single survey. The unique benefit here is that we can look at the interaction of state-level and individual-level factors in public opinion. So we're able to see how demographics and state conditions intersect and affect the reality on the ground in different states in different ways. We also use the census then to even this out and give us much more inferential power from this data than we would if we just simply disaggregated it. So we can talk in questions about this, and Jeff's going to show a lot of data that comes from MRP models as we come up. So what we find here is that states are varying significantly in how opinion is changing over time, and that just because two states are at the same level right now does not mean that they are on the same path for the future. And this is going to be absolutely crucial as the movement looks for venues to continue to enact this change. So here's some findings from the MRP model, and I've put a line at 50% so that we can see that even though we're at a national majority, we've still got a lot of states that are either hovering right around a 50-50 coin flip on opinion, and many states that are still lagging behind. Not to mention the fact that it would be pretty naive to expect a state to flip instantly once public opinion gets to 50% plus 1. We know that's not really how policy responsiveness works. And at the same time, responsiveness is increasing, but it's increasing slowly. So here we've just filled in red the marriage states, and I've left off New Jersey for now, being a bit cautious. And we can see that the most supportive states are starting to flip. We're taking the low-hanging fruit through a variety of legislative and ballot and judicial maneuvers and trying to get marriage there. But the problem, as Skip mentioned, is that opinion and institutions have thrown up a roadblock for us. And so now the states that are in red are the ones that don't have constitutional restrictions. So to make any headway in these blue states, we're going to have to go in there and deal with a constitutional issue. And that might mean that we need both the legislature and the ballot box in some of these states, which is just going to be particularly hard in the least supportive ones. Moreover, the states aren't on the same trajectory. So here we've plotted in green where the states stood in 2004, and in red where they are in 2013. And what we can see is that while the relationship is similar, there's some heterogeneity. They're not in the exact same order that they used to be, but also crucially that the states that were not very supportive in 2004 haven't moved as much as the ones that were already quite supportive. And this is the serious problem, is that we are converting people in places where we don't need to convert them anymore. That the states that were already supportive are taking off, and we're not making inroads in the states where marriage was unpopular and where we're going to have to go from here. So just to illustrate that, I'm just going to put up some of the many point estimates that we can pull out of this model, but this is the absolute magnitude of percentage point change for a few demographic groups in a couple of states where we might want to think about legalizing marriage soon. And while Texans, despite being more supportive of marriage in 2004 than Utahns, have moved considerably more. There were fewer people to convert, and yet we've converted more of them in Texas. And if you look at, states going down the list, if we made the same comparison between Oregon and Texas, we would see that the Oregonians have moved quite a bit more, despite already being much more supportive at the outset. And so to wrap up and to sort of lead into what Jeff's going to talk about in terms of institutional responsiveness, I want to give the insight that I can into whether this opinion change is going to turn into legislative votes. This is from a different study that I ran where we interviewed 2,000 state legislative candidates. This is with David Brockman at UC Berkeley. We asked these candidates what percentage of the people living in the district where they were running they thought support same-sex marriage. And then we used MRP to recover the actual percentage. What we've plotted here is a line that would represent perfect accuracy, and then the average estimates given by liberals in our sample and conservatives in our sample. And what we can see here is that both groups are overestimating how many of their constituents are opposed to same-sex marriage. And among the conservatives, this overestimate is severe. It's about 20 percentage points on average. So this lack of perception is probably going to be another roadblock as we think about opinion translating into legislative votes. And so just to wrap up quickly, we've given a few different perspectives here, but we think that the joint logical implications are that because of these trends, not all the states are going to be ready soon, that the states are on different sorts of trajectories, and different sorts of people, because of disgust and other mechanisms, are also on different sorts of trajectories. So we want to suggest caution as we move forward, and perhaps a reanalysis of the strategies that have gotten us the low-hanging fruit, but might not bear out in the next few years. Thanks.
So it is a pleasure to not only be at the best conference I've ever been at, but the only time when the papers actually fit together on a panel. They always say they do, but they never do. And here it's building. I really want you to think about my comments in terms of what you've heard so far, because I'm in agreement with it, and I think that the message is going to fit together. So I'm going to talk about the political power of gays and lesbians in different contexts, and sort of the effects of opinion on policy and policy change. This is based on joint work with my frequent co-author, Justin Phillips, and also Kate Krimmel. So What are the different paths to progress? There's multiple routes that we could take. Sometimes you pursue civil rights through the courts. There's some success stories, obviously, and some failures. There's some cautionary notes, maybe about backlash, maybe about times when you lost and you thought you'd win, or vice versa. Maybe hollow hopes that there'll be big social change because of court decisions. And of course, Scalia argues that the proper venue for these things is not courts at all. They should be staying out of it because it's, A, driven by an elite homosexual agenda. It's not from the people, it's from the elites anyway. And the normal political process is going to deal with all this. Just relax. Let the normal political process work. I'm going to say no to that. You'll see. Okay. So you can turn to legislatures, and there you're going to be concerned, again, about public support, not just what the legislatures think, but public support. And here we're going to have to worry about the potential limits of opinion effects. So you can see how it connects. So the question is, should we expect current levels of support, which are high, and future gains in public opinion to translate into new policies protecting LGBT individuals, and not just on marriage, but other policies? I'm going to talk more broadly. So the good news is that, yeah, there's huge changes in opinion. There's changes of heart, people actually changing their mind. There's also new voters entering the voting pool who feel differently about these issues, and other voters exiting the voter pool, which is my new favorite euphemism for death. There's lots of work on changing and changes, and we do know as political scientists that public opinion affects policy. Great, but the bad news is that we only see limited responsiveness. Opinion change only has a certain limited effect, and there's limited congruence. And by congruence, I just mean basically majoritarianism. Do majorities get what they want? Is there a match between who is on the liberal side of the majority or the conservative side and what the policy actually is? There is a clear, what we call a democratic deficit for gay and lesbian rights. Now, you might say majorities shouldn't win on a lot of issues, and we certainly do think that for many issues, but it's kind of a little more painful when even when the majority is on the civil rights side of the minority group, you still don't get the protection. That's real pain from the democratic deficit. So I'm going to skip the methods part, but we're using MRP to get opinion broken down by state or congressional district. We're going to compare it to policy or voting in that district. That comparison is what we're going to key off of. And at the state level, I'm going to give you a then and now picture. This will sort of update my findings with Justin Phillips in our published paper. So I'm giving you mean across the states, averaging the 50 states, for 5 of the policies that we're going to look at: adoption, hate crimes legislation, housing and job anti-discrimination laws, and same-sex marriage. And here's the shift across those. Lots of change. Hate, not so much. Maybe housing and jobs, there's much stronger support now. If you look at the number of majorities that are on the pro-gay rights side, dramatic increase for marriage. The 31 is, a bunch of states are really on that cut point around 50, and you can code them one way or the other depending on exactly which poll you use. But still, huge movement. But here's the policy picture. We've gone up on marriage, we've gone up on adoption, but hate, housing, and jobs, not so much. Not so much. Now, maybe the most salient policies are the ones that have been gotten, but the ones that have been fought for the longest haven't been. Okay. If we look at the match, then, between policy and opinion in the states, we can ask whether the bias is in a liberal direction. You have a conservative majority, but you got the liberal policy anyway, or a liberal majority in the conservative policy. And I think you can see pretty quickly that there's not a lot of liberal bias in policy on gay rights in the states. But there's a hell of a lot of conservative bias, where the liberals' majorities are there, and you still don't have the policy. Now, the conservative bias is growing over time because the people have moved, but not the policies. That's worrisome, if you think that opinion is going to be the key driving force here. So what's the bottom line? In 2009 versus 2013, we went from 35% mismatches between opinion and policy to 44%, and we still have a huge percentage of that incongruence in the conservative direction. I want to put that in the context of an assortment, 39 state policies, only some of which are gay rights policies, but I'm going to include them in this overall summary. 52% of the time we saw a mismatch. but at least only 56% was in the conservative direction. So what's surprising about gay rights is not so much the degree of incongruence, but the fact that it's all in one direction. Now, there are other areas where it's the other way. Abortion policies tend to have a liberal bias, so it's not a dominant thing. Obviously, they need to balance out. Okay. I want to quickly move to the federal level. That's where the real meat of what I want to talk about today is. We're going to be looking at districts for congressmen and Senate, obviously the states. 5 different issue areas and 23 different roll call votes across them, from marriage, military service, hate crimes, adoption, and employment. And we looked at basically every vote we could and got where we could get opinion, at least. And combining a whole bunch of polls, and then Mr. P does its work. We can talk about that later. I'm going to quickly skip over this, but I just want you to see that all the lines are kind of going upward. All this is showing is that the probability of a positive pro-gay vote, which is the y-axis, is related to opinion in that district or state on the x-axis. It's up for every policy. I want to give you a summary of this, though, and that's what we'll move from. Here's some data at the level of the member of Congress, the senator or the representative. It's a career voting percentage based on the average of constituent opinion across their votes. So if you cast 5 votes, it's 5 snapshots of opinion and 5 votes, and we're going to look at the percentage. And you can see that the more liberal your constituents are on gay rights, the more likely it is you're casting a greater number of pro-gay votes. Great. But what does that leave out? Well, here are, okay, here are the don't ask, don't tell opinion majorities. I don't know why that's occurring. By a congressional district. As you can see, there's a heck of a lot of pro-gay majorities. And let's look at the voting on that. So you can see, I'll flip back and forth if the computer's not going to crash, lots of blue, but a lot more conservative voting relative to opinion. That mismatch we were talking about. Let's look at job opinion majorities. And we can see, basically, there are very few places where they oppose job discrimination protection. And yet, anyone know if ENDA has passed yet? Yeah. So we have a bit of a problem. Okay, so 60% of the roll call votes we study are congruent with the opinion in their relevant constituency. 75% of the incongruence is in the conservative direction. Okay. Okay. What I want to ask is whether opinion change leads to vote change. Well, there are 5 instances where we can directly compare roll call votes, and we have people who are still in Congress, because, fortunately they stick around a really long time. And we're going to look here at those whose first vote was anti-gay, and what we found was that when opinion change was positive in their home constituency, 13% switched, and when it was negative, only 4% switched. We're going to look at it in a different scale, since there's a lot of opinion change. If the increase was more than the average, 16% flipped, and if it were less than average, only 5% flipped. There's not a lot of switching. The switching does work with opinion, but there's not a lot of switching. Okay, there's a lot of important things that I'm basically misleading you about, because I need to unpack this. Maybe everything's going to be misleading, but we'll see. Okay, remember that picture I showed you before about the congressman's voting records? Well, what I really need to do is break it down by party and maybe by race and party, because the entire effect you saw was basically white Democrats or non-black Democrats. They're the ones where opinion seems to be shifting voting. If you look at black Democrats, they tend to vote on the pro-gay rights side. If you look at Republicans, they don't seem that sensitive to opinion. They tend to vote against gay rights. So if you really want to know where you're going to work on opinion, it might be in the districts or states represented by white Democrats. That's where opinion might have the most leverage. Or you could just elect only black Democrats. Where you put your money, bang for the buck activism, I don't know on that one. Again, there's more switching by white male Democrats than certainly Republicans. The white male Democrats are the ones who are responsible for the switching. But there's differences in responses by type that we can look at in a different way. Suppose you want to get a legislator to a coin flip. I don't know, I'm kind of indifferent on gay rights. I can go either way. What does opinion have to be in that state or district to get them there? To get a white male Republican to vote on the pro-gay rights side, averaged across these issues, you've got to get them to 66%. What I said before about only electing black Democrats, I need to be more specific. You want to only elect black female Democrats, because then you only need to get support to the 31% level. Okay. Now let's look over time. So I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. You're okay with that? Okay. I know my audience. This picture, and the series of pictures, the x-axis will always be over time, and the y-axis is going to be the percentage pro-gay or something of that sort. So ignore all the little lines and focus on the big dashed one that's partly missing. The number of I don't know why it is, but it is. The number of pro-gay opinion majorities has dramatically increased over time. Okay. Note, by the way, I've set aside party because I'm still misleading you. Okay. The number of pro-gay roll call votes, however, has changed to a very limited extent over time. Okay? So voting is not keeping up with opinion. Now, on average, the match between the two is staying the same. I'll explain why in a minute, or 20 seconds, depending on how much time I have left. That's negative 5 minutes or positive? Okay, so overall, the match is staying roughly the same, but the direction of incongruence is changing. You start out early in our time series in the mid-90s, and incongruence is kind of torn between the two. You're losing as many votes to one side as you are the other when legislators are not listening to their constituents. That is by far not the story anymore. We went from rough parity or even a pro-liberal bias on gay rights relative to constituent opinion to a severe constituent bias, such that, what is that, roughly 25% of votes are getting lost that way. That's a huge democratic deficit, and it suggests that we need to not just be moving people if we want to get policy done, because even when you move the people, their representatives are not necessarily listening to them. Okay. Again, as I said, this obscures differences by party, and that's where that's the last set of things I want to talk about. I'm now breaking it down by party. In Democratic represented constituencies, opinion has gone up. In Republican represented constituencies, opinion has gone up. If we look at the number of majorities, it's gone up for both types of districts or states. There's a gap between the two, but they've stayed roughly parallel. Okay, so what's happened at the elite level? The voting in Congress, and we see that the pro-gay voting over time has, on the left, gone up among Dems, and among Republicans it's stayed the same or maybe even gone down. Which is to say that congruence has actually gone up among Democrats over time and down among Republicans over time. And that's why the trend was flat. It's because one side has, with their constituents moved, the constituents moved to match them and they continue to go up, whereas the Republicans have been left behind by their constituents, or at least they're now lagging behind their constituents on this. Which is to say, you don't want to be voting in black female Republicans, because that's not going to work alone, I guess. If we look at the net liberal vote bias, how many votes are gained or lost due to mismatching what your constituents want, the Democrats started out with a pro-liberal bias. They're above that 0 point, but they're now in sync with their constituents. On average, the Democrats are doing what their constituents want. The Republicans started out roughly doing what their constituents wanted, and now at the current point in time, there's a huge conservative bias in their voting behavior relative to their own constituents. Now, I don't mean their primary constituency. I'm not talking about Republicans in their constituencies. I'm talking about the median voter in their constituencies. So we all might have suspicions as to why they're not voting pro-gay against their district. It's that they don't just care about the median voter, they care about the Tea Party median, or something of that sort. Okay, so I'm hoping that I've showed you that legislators respond to opinion to a limited extent. There are differences in responsiveness across legislator types, both by party and by race. Gains will not necessarily lead to, gains in opinion will not necessarily lead to policy change. Even though I think opinion matters, it's really, the effect isn't as strong as you might want it to be on this issue. And so you can't necessarily rely on the political process to further your rights. What does that mean? It means Scalia is wrong. Scalia is wrong. It's not an elite agenda, because the elites in Congress, whatever, are not forcing gay rights down the throats of the people. The people have been saying, don't fire people for being gay for a really long time. So on a lot of these issues, no, the match is best for marriage, actually, between opinion and policy. But on these other issues, the people are way ahead of the elites. So it's not elite-driven, and the normal political processes are not working. It's not the case that, oh, just wait for the majorities to get there, then you'll get the policies you want. It doesn't seem to be working that way.
Thank you.
We all know you're just applauding because I said Scalia was wrong.
Thank you. Well, this is a great set of papers. Let me just spend 5 minutes provoking you all, and then you can respond, and then we'll open up for questions. About 6 months ago, before the Supreme Court decision, I was tempted to write a piece that said, gay marriage is not abortion. And I was, it was right after I was appointed to be the research director for the President's Commission on Election Administration. So I've been gagged ever since. Right now I'm furloughed, so this is one more reason, Jane, you can thank Ted Cruz. Okay, so, and I phrased it as gay marriage instead of marriage equality for a reason, which is, to what extent is the prism through which we look at the public opinion question of same-sex marriage an equality-based one or a liberty one, right? And so I had been of the view, and I should say that so much of my views on this are colored by my co-author and other relationship with Pat Egan, my good friend. I should say our inquiry into public opinion on same-sex marriage was forged in the Georgia state legislature as we were doing the redistricting for the state of Georgia. So while on the one hand we delivered the legislature to the Republicans, on the other hand we've had a lot of articles come out of it. So, you know, you could weigh those. And so that in general, my view was that, look, same-sex marriage, marriage equality is not abortion, because the cohort replacement story which is to say younger people replacing dying homophobes, is one that is not the story with abortion rights, right? That we've had pretty much a continuous, it's jumped up and down over the last 30 years, but there hasn't been as fundamental a shift as we've seen in same-sex marriage. And why is that? Well, maybe because the issue is viewed through an equality lens as opposed to a liberty lens. That's just one possibility. The other, and so if same-sex marriage or marriage equality is not abortion, is it interracial marriage, right? And that's Bill Eskridge was sort of using that comparison. We always use that comparison, where you have, which there is a cohort replacement story there with that slow secular trend going in one direction. In answering this question, you know, the story with abortion rights is often posed that Roe versus Wade hits, there's a polarizing tendency, groups then align and get permanently fixed in place on one side or the other of the issue. And so since so much of the shift in the last 10 years on same-sex marriage, the story that you've heard, and I think you all have complicated the story considerably here, is about cohort replacement and contact hypotheses and things like that. That the conventional wisdom is that it looks more like interracial marriage. But I think one thing that both Skip and Jeff's work, Skip et al., Skip and Logan and Chris's work, and Jeff, is that it's somewhere in the middle right now, which is to say that there's been a huge partisan shift, right, on same-sex marriage, at the same time that there is this cohort replacement story. So if you look at who has shifted, we're talking about the low-hanging fruit. It's not just geographic, right? It's partisan, right? That Democrats have shifted, so it's overwhelmingly the case that 75% or something of Democrats now support same-sex marriage, but that's not true among Republicans. It's in the 20s somewhere, maybe up to 30, but 25%, I think. And though the people who support same-sex marriage among Republicans are disproportionately young, right? And so that you have you can explain the cohort effect maybe more with respect to Republicans than with Democrats. And this huge, really unprecedented shift when it comes to opinion on a social issue over about a 5-year period has to do with this ideologization, is that a word, of the issue, so that then the structure of support for same-sex marriage adopts a very familiar liberal conservative valence, right? So that now we conceive of it in ideological terms, and just conveniently done research to support, I guess, what I'm making, so the structure of support is very similar to some other issues which have a partisan tone. All right, so that's just a provocation to sort of answer the question, how similar is this to other issues? And to some extent, it goes to whether we call it the hollow hope question or maybe the Loving versus Virginia question, of when courts should be involved and what the effect will be. All right, so with that, let me just talk a bit about your paper. So first, on theories of backlash, there's a lot of ways you can talk about backlash. One is, as Charles talks about, which is shift in attitudes as a result of some kind of event. Let me say that one thing that I would encourage you in this paper is to just have a general theory about public opinion change in general, as opposed to backlash theory, because at least in Patton and my work, I mean, we adopt, John Zoller's sort of position or theory of public opinion formation, which is to say that, court decisions are events like any other. They splash in the pond of public opinion, and depending on how elites then manipulate and send signals in the wake of those decisions, you're going to get some shifts one way or the other, and the types of shifts that you're going to get are going to depend on the character of the signal that elites are sending to the mass public. And when I say elites here, I'm talking about Justice Scalia, Karl Rove, Rush Limbaugh, Barack Obama, whoever it is, right? And the character of those signals, and then the pre-existing positions of the population, right? Which is to say how, what the split is, how many people actually have formed opinions, right? And how movable the public is, how informed they are, how salient the splash is. All those kinds of factors are going to affect which direct and public opinion change. So that's why I'm not surprised that in 2013, when you do an experiment, that there's not a whole lot of shift, because most people have made up their minds on same-sex marriage at this point. You're not educating them a lot about that. Whereas in 2003, now you have a graph there dealing with the earlier stuff as well. I want to talk about that. But earlier on, when people hadn't thought about it in ideological terms, then you did have this huge shift, right? First you had a backlash, and then you had, over the year and a half after Goodrich, you had a rising support, mostly among Democrats, but some among others as well. We timed the backlash at Lawrence versus Texas, not Goodrich decision, okay? There's a lesson there which I think is relevant to your work as well, which is it doesn't make a difference if the event is about same-sex marriage or not, okay, to provoke public opinion change, right? So Lawrence versus Texas is perfectly consistent with American public opinion at the time, okay? It then is, when we look at the media discussion of it, it is interpreted as a marriage case, okay? Interpreted, meaning in public commentary. Why? Well, this is the genius of Scalia here, right? Which is, all right, you may think this is about something you agree about, but actually it's about marriage. You see this drop in, the drop already happens before Goodrich, as far as we can tell. And then it lasts through the 2004 election, and then it's really in the summer of 2005 that then you see people coming back. And then this spike, the trajectory we've been on ever since. So there's a story there about public opinion formation and backlash, which again is not, it's I think similar to what you're talking about when you're talking about, well, it doesn't make a difference whether it's the courts, whether it's the legislature, whatever it is. Again, these are events, and how the media and other elites are going to send signals as a result of that is really the question. Let me say, just a kind of bridging point between yours and I think the other papers. I don't know whether, you talk about intensity of preference in yours when you do the experiment. I think that for all of these papers, I just have a kind of general question about intensity and salience, right, of issues. Mainly, the salience question is more for, I think, Jeff's paper, right, which is it right to treat all gay rights controversies equally, or is there something about, would you expect public opinion change to happen, or policy change to be responsive to public opinion on more or less salient issues? I could theorize either way on that, right? And one of the stories, right, with marriage equality is the lack of similar feelings of intensity on the issue, depending on which point in time you're looking at it. So following Lawrence and following Goodrich, it's clear all the intensity is on the anti side of the equation. That has changed a bit, well, not a bit, substantially, since then. And that, I think, is part of the story here, right, is that it's not just 50% plus one, but it's about how intense they are. Then there's another story about the location of the intense voters, right, which there's a kind of responsiveness to primary electorate story, which might jibe with what you're finding with congressional districts, okay? And so I would sort of ask that question. Then there's a larger issue, which is, well, how different is gay rights today from other issues that are just seen through a partisan lens, which is to say everything, right? So that you find that they're unresponsive on issues of gay rights. Well, they're also unresponsive on issues of a continuing resolution or debt default, right? So and why is that? I mean, it's even more lopsided, right? Whereas the Democrats are responsive to their constituents, they're willing to pass something, and Republicans are not. Well, then isn't that basically the same story? And is that basically a story of the last 4 years or so that then can be described across issues? One final point, and this is really an empirical, since I don't know enough about the literature on disgust, let me just loft it out there, maybe you can educate me on this, which is, how does that jive with the generational replacement story? I mean, is the point about disgust that, okay, people who are disgusted at time one on any given issue are going to be hard to move, and so we sort of give up on them. And so therefore the strategy is to go with, so the younger generations are less likely to be disgusted on issues of sex, et cetera. Or is it possible that the questions that are measuring disgust are almost sort of too close on the issue of gay rights than they are on other issues which you're measuring disgust? And by that I mean that basically disgust is almost becoming a proxy for the way you feel about gay rights. And so that actually when you do, this would be the theory, when you do come in contact with, if your child comes out, you're both more likely to switch on your attitudes with respect to disgust and switch your opinions on same-sex marriage, right? I just sort of lawfully, you can tell me what, maybe there's actual research on this. But I am interested in whether there is, these alternative strategies which you all talk about. You kind of left us hanging there a little bit, so maybe that's because you wanted to answer it in questions. So I gather that given the point about disgust, that there's another strategy lurking there that would be useful to get some views on that. So I'll end with that and let you all bicker, and then whoever wants to come and ask questions should come up to the mic. Who wants to go first?
Is same-sex marriage abortion or interracial marriage? Yes. Same-sex marriage is abortion or interracial marriage. I'm not sure that, I think the people many of the people who say, gee, I could never, ever, ever support same-sex marriage in some locales around the country, probably are not that stoked about interracial marriage either, but they don't want to, it's not something you can say in polite company anymore. And this isn't just anecdotal. In Louisiana, on more than one occasion in the last 36 months, interracial couples have been not able to get marriage licenses, interracial straight couples. One of the justice pieces that was the guy doing this has since retired, but the notion that that these are choices that are different, which one is same-sex marriage like? They may not be that different. It may be more Venn diagramming, that there is some rigid number of people who think what they think about abortion and will never ever evolve, in President Obama's language. But there may be that kind of base number as well with interracial marriage. So I think we've seen some research from Greg Lewis that it isn't just cohort replacement, that cohort replacement matters, but a lot more is going on. There's actually, changes happening in attitudes. But I think for our paper, the critical take-home point is that policymakers who oppose same-sex marriage or marriage equality for whatever reason can't really hang it on the constituents. And those persuadable white Democrats who say, gee, you're in jail, Martin Luther King, because you're a troublemaker, be patient and everything will work out, are really the ones that we should be working on. And this work demonstrates that they don't need to fear the public's going to rise up and throw them out of office if they do support marriage equality. And this follows on some work that Ben and I did about when the legislatures defy popular opinion and vote pro-gay on things. So, is it abortion or interracial marriage? Maybe those are not as spread apart as they.
Well, part of what I'm saying, I want to get everyone else, but is what the trajectory of opinion and the story about what the future is holding, right? Because, depending on what you think the driving forces are for change, one would have a different theory about the responsiveness of legislatures, et cetera. Anyway, but do you all want to weigh in?
Yeah. So to answer your first two questions and then also talk about the alternate strategy. With respect to how discuss plays into the generational story, it's not the case, at least with the research that I've done so far, that there are particular age cohorts that are more or less likely to be easily disgusted. And in fact, in the studies that I mentioned that were illustrating that disgust is unique in its connection to LGBT issues and not other political issues, that result held true even when controlling for things like the age of the respondents, gender, education, and so on. And so it was.
Let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. But you're not saying that younger people are just as likely to be disgusted as older people, or are you saying that?
Saying that holding constant considerations like age and other demographic factors, people who are more easily disgusted in general tend to then have more negative opinions or express less support for policy issues relating to gay topics. And with respect to the questions about whether those questions are too close to gay rights themselves, and so disgust is just become a code word for gay issues, it's not at all the case. The standard psychological questionnaire about this, and so there's a self-reported measure, so we can talk about that too, but it mentions nothing at all about gay sex or gay marriage. From what I call it's 25 questions, and they tend to be much more about the sort of core level of disgust or contamination disgust. Questions like, it wouldn't bother me to eat monkey meat. It wouldn't bother me, agree or disagree. How disgusting would you find that to be, that sort of thing. Touching dead bodies. So it's this much more sort of visceral level reaction that doesn't expressly at all invoke questions of gay rights. And so that's the really interesting thing to me about it, is that the measures of disgust that have been used so far in the psychological literature that I've read on this topic aren't asking about disgust related to gay issues, and yet are invoking a whole host of responses about LGBT attitudes and policy issues. So I don't think it's about the questions. We can answer other questions and we'll come back to them.
The strategy, should we just... I think do you want to do that or you want me to do it? You go ahead. Yeah, in terms of the strategy, we did leave that hanging out there. Here's the basic idea. The movement has been, and Chris and Logan have helped me with this, the movement has really gone from emphasizing rights and benefits to love and commitment, and that's been great. There's a literature on persuasion and strategic communication that talks about the importance of shared values and expanding a coalition in support of an idea. But the question to ask is, if the story is now going to be just like us, how far is that going to take? How far can you expand the tent like that, particularly when you think that maybe there isn't a similarity? And so right now, we talked about this yesterday, our gay icons tend to be white, well-dressed, and very well-lit on television. And so, we can tell a story about just like us because, of course, we're all like that. But we drew a distinction yesterday between, LGB and T, right? If I'm trans and I walk to a door and I ask someone and I introduce myself as such, right? Can I tell the just like us story? Or in the longer run, am I more likely to get people to sort of, wouldn't it be better in the longer run if people recognized my differences and said, yes, we share important values, we share some commitments, and we're different, right? As opposed to trying to hide that. So as we think about the next steps, it's not clear that just like me is actually the best way to expand the coalition if we know that people at some level say, no, particularly the ones of you that aren't well lit. Yeah.
As opposed to the political scientists in the room, you know.
Yeah, skips and glow, you know. But you know, irrespective of whether the messaging, particular messages are working or not, the sum total of what the movement has done to try to move people so far has moved some people in Utah and Mississippi, but not as many people as it has moved other places. And so, you know, we're not here saying, you know, those people are never going to be with us, they're not coming with us, because there has been movement in every single demographic group in every single state over the past decade. But the sluggishness in some of these states, you know, seems to suggest that at least for certain people while they are alive, there is some kind of a ceiling. And at least so far, we haven't figured out how to get past that ceiling.
Yeah, there's another sort of ceiling.
Or a floor, below the floor.
Yeah. But if Chad wants to get us to 50 in 5 years, and he wants to do that through democracy, you know, we're going to show
democracy again.
We have trouble in Mississippi unless something changes.
But so the story, and this is a bridge to Jeff, again, there's been change in those areas. There are also some Democrats in those areas, right? They've been the ones more, well, no, I mean, you know, you're talking about small change, they're the ones who are more likely to change, as well as the young folks. And so, I mean, this is a bridge to Jeff's work, which is, you know, the test is, well, when will the states with unified Republican governments pass constitutional amendments, right? That's sort of the you know, policing the outliers question that you're sort of posing. Yeah.
To answer the sort of take a guess here, I don't really want to say it's like abortion or interracial marriage. I think the trajectory of opinion change here is is unique. It's not really like those. This is an amazingly quick changing area. I still think the policy fight's going to be more drawn out than on interracial marriage. And then there's a bunch of other policies that we are going to want to talk about that have been settled on the race issue. You can't fire someone for being black. And so these other issues are still lurking there. There are big salience effects. The more salient the issue, the more likely it is that opinion will move policy, and the greater the likelihood of a match between policy and opinion, which has the ironic effect, and there's a class effect here that was alluded to, that if you're a poor person in an anti-gay rights state, it's not that you might not think marriage is more important than protection against being fired. You might not. But I think you're going to push them at least closer together than the state where you're not worried about being fired for being gay. And so to the extent that the concentration has been on the salient issues, there are these really, you know, major gaps. And I'm not sure what could be done to trigger opinion in those areas, but I worry a lot about that as well, not just the marriage question, but basic job and housing discrimination in states that are really going to lag behind for quite some time. I do think that a lot of what's going on is the primary constituency. I'm not at the point where I think my data speak accurately enough to that to say much on that, but I think that's right. We are currently working, and this I have more trust that we'll be able to do, in looking at whether it's intense people that are being responded to. And so I'll have an answer for you at some point, but not yet. How different is the gay rights policies from the others? I gave you some information. If you want me to compare this to other federal areas, that's something we're looking to do. I think that the bias is in one direction. I don't think it's unusual for opinion to not directly control policy, but I do think the amount of bias here is significant, as well as the fact that this is an area where we do worry. We worry when it's a minority group, and when the majority supports you and you don't get what you want. That's really weird, really worrisome. Finally, I just want to say if there are other issues you think we need to be looking at in terms of district or state level opinion on gay rights stuff, and you want us to come up with good estimates and you have some national poll data, come talk to me, or if you don't like me, and I understand, talk to Chris, because we are looking to expand the number of issues and questions we're focusing on to look at the spread of opinion and to pick up on the nuances that Chris and his co-authors have been so cleverly looking at.
Great. Well, fantastic panel. Thank you so much. So much to react to. I just want to throw a few questions and thoughts out and let anyone answer, although they are somewhat directed. So, Charles, your final injunction to us was, go forth and sue and don't worry about backlash. You do have a lot of lawyers in the room, so I'm not so sure in the following sense that what you were really looking at was opinion backlash. And it seems to me the implication of the other papers, especially the Michigan group paper, is that a policy backlash can be very long-lasting and hard to dislodge when there are particular institutional structures in place. So even if you're not getting an opinion backlash, future, rises in opinion might not be able to surmount that institutional barrier. So, the idea of disaggregating different kinds of backlash, I think, makes some sense here. So I wonder if you'll temper your injunction to we lawyers on that. The second thing was I wanted to ask Logan if there's, there was a really disturbing article in the New York Times in the last month about the rise in anti-gay violence in New York. And, you don't want to overreact to what's going on in one city. But I wonder if any of you knows about, and this goes to the idea of the contact hypothesis doesn't always play out. I mean, it's been a staple in gay rights advocacy for decades to say the more people know openly, LGBT people, the more tolerant they are. And I think that's true as far as it goes, but it may be the people who have the strongest negative feelings and maybe the small group of those who are actually going to react violently when they see more open, displays of affection, when marriage has been legalized. And I don't know if that connects at all to the research about disgust or if there is anything more systematic about whether the increasing move to marriage equality is accompanied in any way by a different kind of a backlash, a marginal group, but still more violence. Let's see, the last thing, I think this was Jeff talking about, that there really is such sluggish progress toward things that there seem to be majority support for, like, end anti-discrimination protections, housing, and other things. And I've had the impressionistic view for a while that once marriage came on the scene and became the kind of, for a long time, less so now, but the kind of polarizing, provocative issue that it was, suddenly things that used to seem less controversial were talked about in terms of marriage. Well, if we have non-discrimination laws, then, that's going to necessarily lead to marriage, or, just connected up to that issue among those who I think probably oppose marriage equality more than they oppose job discrimination. So it's had kind of a weird effect in distorting what issue we're actually talking about at a time. So, questions and thoughts?
So just first response is, Tom, well, you might not know, Tom Keck published this article several years ago about backlash, and it's this doctrinal qualitative piece where he looks at some cases and says, he essentially says, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? So if the status quo is unacceptable and the legislative is a dead end, then really it's the only alternative you've got. And what we're saying is that you need not fear public opinion backlash because of litigation, and that has been a consistent story whenever rights have been contested in courts. There's always been a popular pushback and a political elite pushback that, oh no, you're going to irritate the public, and then we won't be able to do anything policy, so you just have to go slow and be patient. In fact, everything the Prop 8 litigants were told before they went forward with their litigation from some of the other groups, including HRC at the time. So the notion that litigation should result in public opinion bad things happening, I don't think there's robust support for this. And the bad policy, well, if the status quo was already bad, Keck's point was, yeah, you might lose in court, but if you've already lost before you sue, you got to try or you're never going to win. So.
Although you then have new barriers when opinion moves.
Yeah.
Next thing. Yeah. Unless you want to go.
I do think that it's an interesting question what's going to happen with marriage now dominating the policy discussion. I think that if marriage comes down from on high and they don't do the suspect class thing, the resistance has to go somewhere, and it might go to continue to block at the state level the job and housing protection. And so there could be a policy backlash of that sort, unless maybe the changes in the other areas also come from on high. And so I do worry about that the window may have been missed, and there was a time when maybe it could have been done. I don't know.
Yes, that was a really great question. And I think you're right that the role of contact here is really important. And I think one of the things I sort of glossed over in my in my rush was that I mentioned at the beginning that disgust is an emotion that compels a sort of aversion, want to create distance. And one of the empirical findings that's been supported empirically in the literature that inducing disgust does lead people to be more avoidant of contact with LGBT people, which is particularly interesting given the findings that we've talked about yesterday and over again about how influential disgust can be in changing hearts and minds on our issues. And so not just that these folks are already more prone to have negative attitudes, but also to avoid the very specific interaction that we have been relying upon to reduce those negative attitudes. But I also want to say that aversion, to speak to your point about violence, that aversion can be enacted not just in a way of like avoiding or not thinking about something or walking away from, avoiding contact with, but also in a way that, I want to avoid this so much or express aversion literally to the extent that you literally want to make it go away. And sometimes that can be through violent means. So these cases of gay bashing or trans bashing, the invocation of violence as this like strongly aversive expression of this disgust reaction. And another of the behavioral implications that I didn't get to, and this is going to get back to the physiological point that I really wanted to make and then didn't, so sorry, was that disgust, particularly because of the sort of physiologicalness of this emotion, scholars have talked about it, that all emotions have a sort of physiological component, but that disgust in particular is this really strongly embodied visceral, guttural reaction that has a unique facial expression that, like even Darwin talked about this unique facial expression. And I don't mean to implicate biology and politics in this sort of way, but just to say that there's a deep embodiedness of this experience that we're not always necessarily in control of. And so this physiological embodiedness of it that we're not in control of can make us for folks who feel this sort of disgust reaction, can make them resistant to rational argument in a way that would offer us a headwind for thinking about going forward, especially given that so many of our strategies have been reliant upon this sort of appeal to equality or to reason, or you think about the strategies of 1,138 rights denied by DOMA, these sort of rational appeals to equality. And so this resistance to rational argument is also problematic concern that disgust brings up for us. People who experience disgust are probably more likely to look like the pictures that Skip showed with the homosexuals are possessed by demons sign. And this is particularly true, if I can just say one more thing that I left out. That chart that I showed up there at the end of like gay leading to disgust reactions leading to political outcomes, if we think about gay more broadly as just sort of other. If we start varying the other, and this is what Skip was saying about the images that aren't always presented of the LGBT communities, if we start varying the sort of normativity of that gay elicitor, that itself would also vary the disgust reactions, or perhaps the intensity of the disgust reactions, or the particular political outcomes that might result from those. And so this would, again, emphasize the sort of limit of the Just Like Us campaigns, particularly given that for as long as we've been using those campaigns, there continue to be people for whom they are not persuasive. And furthermore, for people within our community, there are people for whom that claim simply isn't true. We're not just like other people. Or even if you were, you might have no interest in invoking that ideology of, my acceptance or rights are contingent upon being just like you. And so the alternate strategy that I would like to propose at some point is getting away from this normalizing strategy, or at least that there's a limit at some point of its efficacy. And moving forward, we might have to think more about this rhetoric that Skip was bringing up of, yes, I'm different, or even perhaps to you disgusting, but there's no need for the acting out in a political context of that emotional reaction.
So we have 4 people. We've got 15 minutes. So let me ask the people on the panel to respond quickly. Bill.
I want to follow up on Jane's questions. Nate, the point that you made is one that Jane made about 15 years ago. For her, the difference between the Loving line of cases and the marriage line of cases is that in Loving and Perez before that, here in California, one of the political parties didn't try to mobilize on the issue the way the Republicans did in the 1990s. But I want to know from the panel, can you look at the Republican Party dynamically as well as public opinion dynamically? So, for example, Obama gave them a campaign issue on a silver platter when he came out of the closet in favor of gay marriage in 2012. And Mitt Romney was perfectly poised as the leading opponent of gay marriage in Massachusetts to seize on this issue and demagogue with it, but he really didn't seem to do that. Windsor comes down this year. And what did we hear out of the Republican Party after Windsor? I don't think we've heard very much. We're hearing much more out of the Cheneys and the Melameds and all of the openly gay or parents of gay people in the Republican Party. We're hearing much more out of them than we are out of the Republicans who, are gay bashers. So my question is, so the partisan nature of it certainly does distinguish Loving to a certain extent, but to what extent might that be going away, as a partisan issue? And I really am interested in what your data show, on that, and just what your opinion is about the trajectory of the Republican Party. I don't think they're going to become a pro-gay party. It might be more like the Catholic Church, where it gets emphasized less in their platforms. They still might not be good votes, etc. The other question that follows up on Jane is really a question that goes to litigation. As many of us have been saying in this room, we were not going to win a 50-state gay marriage thing in 2013. We were never going to win that. But what you're suggesting is there was another danger, even if we had the votes to win it in 2013. Would it have been premature? Okay. And I actually did a presentation out in Missouri a few months ago, where I spoke to a bunch of bar people, and I said, well, what if in Perry and Windsor they do a 50-state solution? What would be the reaction here in Missouri? And no one would say anything. So I said, well, you look like you have something to say. The guns would come out, was the Missouri answer. This is not Mississippi, this is Missouri. And so part of the quote-unquote backlash really is the Janey. It's not just normal gay violence, but it's terrible gay violence, possibly. I think it would also be legislative violence, and not just the failure to pass anti-discrimination laws, but the kind of massive resistance, or maybe something short of massive resistance, by state legislatures to make it very difficult to enforce marriage equality in many of the states, not all of the states, that are now resistant to it. And then maybe some kind of other forms of counter-mobilization. And the question really is...
So there will be a question.
Yes. Let's say the cases come back in 2015, 2016. And on both the generic, the trends and the numbers, including the state disparity, are we still going to have a fair number of states where there's going to be overall significant opposition to marriage equality, both in terms of numbers and in terms of intensity? Because I think the intensity question is also very important. Are the people in Mississippi and Texas and whatever the other states that they're going to be, are they going to still be very negative, but intensely negative? And is that something that we should be cautious about in the next round? Because I think cases might get to the court within 2 or 3 years. And then we'll all be faced, the legal people like me are all ready to go with briefs asking for 50-state marriage equality. Is your message to us that we should be more cautious?
I don't think that's my message necessarily.
Let's know what your message is.
Okay, so you asked what my opinion is. You also asked what the data say. I'm going to mix the two without telling you which is which is so good old political science. That's right. So I think that what happened was that the party platforms get stated on gay rights now rigidly, whereas before there's a lot more blurring on the issue. That leads to party voting and polarization within Congress and reduced responsiveness. So the platforms move, and then responsiveness gets limited. Well, you're right. The Republicans are not being as vocal on these issues, and opinion change is going to maybe make them think this is not the place where they want to be drawing the big distinctions between the parties. And so it could be that if the pressure to stick to party platform relaxes, we will start to see more responsiveness, and I might be overreacting in my skepticism that opinion change will lead to policy. It just may be through the elite route in the end, through the platform route, perhaps. The other question was about coming up in 2015-16. Yeah, we're going to see a lot more states flip over at the pro-gay side. There will still be definite, non-negligible groups that are strongly opposed in the bottom list of states on the graph I'm picturing in my head from Chris. A greater percentage of those left will be more intense, is my guess. So if you want to know how intense is the opposition as a percentage of opposition, that's going to go up. Because the people who are wavering will move, will change, will give up on it, and that group's not going to go anywhere. That's my guess, and I think you should correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I agree with Jeff on that, and a great deal of the variation here is happening at the state level. Mm-hmm. When we set up the models with state-level predictors and individual-level ones, state culture and state conditions are doing a lot. The Deep South is very different on this issue than the rest of the country, and that suggests to me that if we try to go in 2015-16, we're still going to be facing a lot of opposition there. And I think the only thing I would add to what Jeff said about legislative responsiveness is that in our data from the candidate survey, I think we're picking up that there's a large group of legislators who just aren't keeping up with the times, right? In 2004, the reason the Republicans ran on this is you could draw a bright line around the country and say, everybody opposes it, it's safe. And now we're in an interesting area of variation where the Democrats tend to think that it's pretty safe for them to come out, right? And with some pressure, all the Democratic senators did. But the Republicans, we've got a group of them who are, just have hubris and they say, I know my people are with me on this issue. A group of them who maybe support us but are scared because they misperceive public opinion. And then a pretty big chunk that just has no idea what's going on because it's very dynamic and they don't poll their districts all that often.
And some are scared of the primary.
True, certainly.
Yeah.
And it could be that they will shut down the government and furlough Nate yet again, unless they get rid of gays or something like that. I mean, I don't know what will be next on that list, and so you could have more vacation time.
You have a day job.
So easy to forget.
Okay, well, we've got so many people. Kenji, why don't you go and? There seems to have been some cue changing here. Was Dara first, I think? Yeah, I think Kenji.
Are you having a sit-in to protest our research?
With Mr. P.
All right, quick responses.
Okay,
folks.
so, and I'll try and keep this quick as well. So Marion Case wrote a great article now, I think 15 years ago, about how courts tended to be most favorable to gay individuals when their partners were incapacitated either through incarceration or through death or through disability. And she said once you take sex out of the picture, then disgust goes out of the picture, and then there's a more favorable perception by the courts. So I guess my question is, how much is disgust related to sex and to marriage, respectively? Because you could think of marriage as going either way if you accept Marianne's description, right? Because it seems like the people who are now anti-same-sex marriage are the ones who are talking about sex all the time, and the people who are for same-sex marriage are talking about love and commitment and what have you. So it's the Robbie Georges of the world who say, this is a two bodily union, and let me just talk you through the mechanics of how it works to create this union. And so they're talking about sex almost insistently, and we're talking about something else, right? So I'm wondering if one of the things, like, and I don't mean to be totally facetious about this, but I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek here, that death, incarceration, or disability, that marriage is such an estate, that takes sex out of the picture. So when you get married, one of the things that you stop thinking about is that those two individuals are having sex with each other.
I think that is exactly. I think that's exactly the point, right? Is that sex and marriage. I'm trying to think how to respond to your comment because it's exactly what I've been thinking. I agree.
Then could I ask a really quick question? So you showed a slide that was susceptible to do different interpretations with respect to the 50 states, I think, because one way of interpreting the idea that there would be a line with respect to a certain cut in time, and then there would be a much greater variance with respect to the more liberal states and a much smaller variance with the more conservative states, is to say, well, this is just, we picked all the low-hanging fruit, and so there are a certain number of persuadables nationwide, and we picked them all, and so this is going to be a much harder row to hoe from now on. Another way of interpreting that slide is a sort of critical mass analysis to say that once you hit a certain tipping point, then you get a higher jump after that. And so the problem with Utah is not that it's not Massachusetts. The problem with Utah is that there are not enough Utahns to compose a critical mass such that there would be more contact among individuals who actually knew somebody who was gay, such that there would be that spike. So are you saying that this is overdetermined, or are you plunking down for one?
Underdetermined, I think, is what we would say.
Underdetermined, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that what you're saying is right, and definitely you're getting at what I would expect the causal mechanism to be. When you look at the trends, both nationally and within state, there's not sort of an exponential growth, right? It is very linear at pretty much any way you slice the data, but it does feed back. So I'm not sure tipping point analogies are quite right, but we're getting, obviously more support breeds more support.
I agree completely with Chris. I might underline the anti-tipping point idea even more. I don't think it quite works that way, and it can be misleading in a scholarly way, but also dangerous if you're going to base things on I just need to get those 2 more votes. No, I don't need a third. Just 2 more people, and then I tip over. I would avoid that interpretation.
One thing that happens in the public a lot is that short-term trends or medium-term trends in data are overinterpreted. Like, that happens all the time. And so
you're here in political science.
So I mean, the real challenge here is that I think the things we're putting out there, both sides have access to, right? And so the idea that you're going to start to hear the opponents of marriage equality talk more about sex is exactly what I would do if I was advising them. I would make it all about that all of a sudden. And so now that you have that, and with the sort of, when you drill down to state-level demographic movements, there are real big differences. And so when you combine those two things, it may be that the people who haven't changed, given the current argument, that they're resistant in ways that we don't anticipate. And so the past trend wouldn't be meaningful. And that's the thing that we're really trying to look at now.
We've got 4 minutes and 4 people. Dara, why don't you ask your question? Maybe can we do the questions? Sure. And then we'll do.
Okay. Like everyone, I'm going to try to be super fast. See how well I do. So, and I actually think this dovetails pretty well with this point. One of them was, Logan, I think this work sounds really interesting, but I think part of the implication of what Kenji was just saying and a few other presentations over the last few days, Marianne's this morning, Pace's yesterday, is that there are, I guess, well, I'll jump to the second thing, to a sort of fourth caution, and I think this is a sort of different one in that it's harder to operationalize empirically, but it's basically the path-dependent, the policy feedback, the unintended consequences of what we think of as victories at the time that they happen. And in the case of the biggest victories for LGBT people in the last year or so, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal and marriage equality, or whatever you want to call it, I think, the next panel will address some of this. People have mentioned it, and for the sake of time, I won't go on about it, but I think it's one of the other things we need to be cautious about, right, is how this redraws boundaries of deserving and undeserving, what repulses us and what does not repulse us, et cetera. And we can talk a little bit more about that, perhaps in the final session. Logan, I think where that kind of dovetails with your research is the idea, okay, so I'll digress to a small story. My family kept kosher when I was growing up. We lived in a neighborhood with almost no Jews in it. And on Sunday mornings, sometimes we would go for a walk, and my mother would say, "Smell that? It was bacon in the air." That's not your smell, right? And to this day, it makes me kind of sick. It's taught, right? I sort of learned to be disgusted by this. It's a political process. It's constructed. And I think that's part of what you're trying to get at. It might be worth sort of thematizing a little bit more explicitly. I'll stop there and let other people talk. But.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. One of the things... I'm sorry, I forgot. I got so excited.
Okay, I'm going to make 2 points really fast. One is, a question about disgust and desensitization. As I would expect hundreds of thousands of same-sex couples get married over the next 2 or 3 years, there are going to be a lot more people out there that folks will have to contend with. And I think that's a big unknown as to what that means in terms of the contact hypothesis. Number 2, everything that's happened in this last 2 days has kind of led me to see how the cracking open of identities and their connection to anti-gay animus, hostility, marriage, or any of the other issues seems to be going away, or at least we are starting to learn some of the tools about how to make those go away, seem really important in terms of thinking about the next 5 years, because the gay organizations are learning from this research. Whether it's you can, somehow get Giants fans to San Francisco Giants fans to support gay marriage because their pitchers support gay marriage. The churches now are starting to support it. Sort of what it means to be a Republican, to be religious, to be African American, to be a Giants fan, whatever, no longer is connected to anti-gay prejudice. So what happens then to the kinds of models and trends that you're thinking about? So I'm curious about what you would be looking for to see happen if that dynamic shifts.
My question is also related to the relationship between law and personal identity, because as Logan mentioned, the notion of disgust seems to be more closely related to maybe the more private and sexual aspect of human life, whereas people tend to be less likely to feel disgust for things such as immigrant rights and things like that. But if you look at immigration history in the U.S., actually back in the 19th century, there were historical and literary accounts that depicted the mental and physical, the disgusting traits of the so-called Asian race and other racial groups. So I was just wondering, and also relating back to the relationship between gay marriage and the interracial or marriage and abortion. So I'm just trying to understand those intertwining relationship between race, class, and ethnicity, and also how our laws should address the constructedness of people's personal identity, especially when we are trying to strive for the equality among all groups of people.
Last question, and then.
So I just had a question for Logan in terms of disgust, in terms of, I think it goes back to not only is it a generational question, but then also within individual over time, like how stable of a construct is disgust? Do people have different disgust sensitivities at different stages of life? Just curious about that. And then also, I liked Nate's comment about intensity of preferences. And I know that we're at a marriage equality conference, but I think in terms of theory of governance and power, that like Robert Dahl and thinking about intensity of preference and what gets put into policy has a big explanation to a broader discussion in terms of political science and political theory. So I know that you're all working on these projects and will write on these projects, and so I look forward to reading and seeing how these contribute to these broader ideas, and not only how they speak to LGBT equality, but then also how they speak to our ongoing discussions about power.
Who wants to take it up? Should we go?
I have plenty of things to say. So
Intensity of
I think Logan's the popular one. I give my time to Logan.
I think we're off the hook.
that disgusts me.
It's not making you all avoid me, so that's nice. I'll try to answer each of those quickly. Dara, I think what I was going to say was about your questions about the unintended consequences of the victories that we're having now, and sort of the terms of the debate is a question that I'm really interested in. And I think you're absolutely right to talk about that disgust is taught. And so that's another alternate strategy that we could propose here is like we can still ask people to sort of diffuse the disgust reaction from gay people or gay sex, but not so much necessarily by the normalizing strategy, but rather by like why is it that you think that's disgusting? Like actually engaging people on the disgusting and implicating them in the discussion of their own reactions as opposed to the object or person that is eliciting the reaction, if that makes sense. And so relying less on disgust is the way I talked about it actually is sort of a like natural thing that operates biologically, but rather the social function of disgust, the way that it's, one of my advisors back at Michigan talks about it as a tool for social regulation. So thinking about that. And then with respect, Lee, your question about increasing marriage and increasing contact, what that means for, as more people get married, the amount of contact is going to increase and people having to think through these issues and what that's going to mean for prejudice moving forward, given the visibility of marriage. We're already seeing in the contact hypothesis literature, particularly about LGBT interactions, more and more conditions under which contact, more conditions that contact needs to meet in order to actually change minds. So it's no longer just the argument that like you meet a gay person, bam, you're suddenly more persuasive, but it needs to be someone in a particular social sphere. It needs to be over a certain amount of time. You need to actually have deep conversations about politics. And so I think you're right that as contact increases, particularly as a function of marriage visibility and ongoing LGBT political movements, things will get better. But I think it's not just the simple story that we used to tell, and maybe this is a straw man, but not just the simple story we used to tell, but the fact that the increased visibility is going to force people to have these more difficult conversations. And particularly as it relates to sex and like what marriage means for sex, and given the right's sort of focus on marriage as procreative, and which itself is a conversation about sex, we're going to have to talk more about the role of sex in our lives. And so I think that's something that's going to come about as well. And
got to run. Who's? Oh well, and then I'll let you finish.
All the questions are for Logan.
I think
we're off the hook.
The question about immigration history is exactly spot on. I haven't thought through this all yet, but Nate, I was thinking as you were asking the question about is gay marriage more like abortion or like interracial marriage, I think it's more about like immigration than anything else, particularly if we go back to this turn of the century sort of focus on immigration of as groups were coming to America, the responses were about how dirty and disgusting these groups were and sort of marking them as other in these ways. And so this is, I'm just talking right now, so I don't have this very well thought out, but I think the immigration analogy is exactly right. And so I think the work that can be done to sort of theorize the responses in the current context to LGBT political activism going forward, comparing that to responses to immigration politics right now is going to be really fruitful, no pun intended. And then, Andrew, with respect to your question about how stable disgust is over time, I don't know. That's on the agenda.
On that empirical question, we'll end it. Thank you very much. It's wonderful.